My name is Jane, but it's not me who's going to do the presentation. I'm going to be joined by Paul and Sean, who are going to make themselves appear magically in any minute now. There we go. There's Paul and there's Sean. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to hand you over to Paul, who's going to start the presentation. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for that welcome and introduction, and a warm welcome from myself and Sean. We're going to talk you through this evening's webinar, and the subject, as you know, is learn to listen, but perhaps particularly from a Samaritan point of view, and to talk about some of the skills and techniques that we use when we listen to callers. So we'll tell you a little bit about who we are as Samaritans and what we do, particularly bearing in mind the learn to listen and active listening skills. We'll talk a little bit about how you can recognize when somebody isn't doing okay, particularly around their emotional health and well-being. We'll talk a little bit about how you can start having a conversation with somebody that is struggling emotionally, because that can be particularly difficult. Even though it sounds a little bit of a kind of rude word, shush, we will cover one of the tools and techniques that we use as Samaritans, and that's a mnemonic to help us remember how to move through a conversation with somebody. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how you can sign somebody to the Samaritans if you feel that somebody would benefit from talking to a trained Samaritan. So there you go. So I'll hand you over now to Sean, and Sean will talk a little bit about who we are as Samaritans. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Paul. So Chad was a vicar of St. Stephen's, City of London. His first call was taken on the 2nd of November 1953. He called that service then being single-handed as a man willing to listen with the base and an emergency telephone. We are all ordinary people from different backgrounds with one common goal: to be there for our callers. We give all our callers our time and attention freely. We are not paid to do it. We aren't professionals and we don't offer counselling, but we will direct callers to other services if it becomes apparent it's the right thing to do. We undergo an intensive training program which is valued highly outside of Samaritans. By the time a Samaritan has completed their training, they are able to listen strongly. We'll be sharing some of the ways we learn to be good listeners in today's event.
Thank you, Sean. So a little bit about what we do as Samaritans, particularly around the subject of learn to listen. So as Sean said, from fairly humble beginnings with Chad Vara all those years ago, we've grown into an organisation that's got over 200 branches available around the UK. And we endeavour to provide 24/7, 365 days a year support to people who need to talk to us and for us to listen. It's estimated that every 9 seconds somebody will call a Samaritan and we will answer that call. Importantly, we offer a listening service. I think historically the Samaritans have been thought of as a suicide service. And whilst we know that some of our callers are in such a dark place that they're considering that as an option, primarily we're listening. And I think that's why it's so important to talk tonight about this learn to listen service and active listening as a technique. We also provide a service that is confidential, and we know that that's valued by our callers as well. So for example, when somebody rings us on the telephone, we don't see that telephone number, so we've got no contact details at all. And if somebody decides to email as well, again, we don't see that email address. So I think, again, people value the fact that it's confidential, and we only get personal details, if you like, if somebody decides to share that with us. And those of you may have heard Scarlett Moffat talking on Monday about her calls to the Samaritan, and now she's an ambassador to the Samaritans. And she was saying the confidentiality of the service was something that made her call, and she recognised that was different to perhaps speaking to a family member or a friend. And importantly, we're non-judgmental. So from the start, the recruitment process, all the way through our training, all through our mentoring and our continued support as Samaritans, our callers know that if they call us to talk about anything, they know that they're not going to be judged on the subject matter they talk about. As Sean said, we're not a counselling service, we're not psychotherapists, or we're not bereavement counsellors. What we feel as Samaritans is by actively listening to somebody, talking through their concerns and their worries, that hopefully we will help support them to make their own decisions. So rather than us telling them what to do, as I said, we'd rather them come to that decision themselves. And we think, as I said, it's useful then for them to find their way forward because it's their journey. So rather than us suggesting something that might not fit, as I said, we'd rather them come up with their own suggestions and a way forward. And clearly, because when somebody picks up a telephone and calls us, they know they're going to speak to another human being. Or if somebody emails us, they know there's another human being picking up that email as well. And I think that's important as well, because I think through our kind of listening service or our writing of our emails, and we do that in a structured way that shows that we've got empathy, that shows we care for somebody when they're telling us about their worries, that we think that ultimately reduces their distress and despair. Although, as I said, the Samaritans isn't predominantly a suicide service, I mean, clearly suicide, as I said, is part of some of the calls we get. So if we pause a second to have a look at suicidal statistics within this country, you'll notice that this is a slide from 2018. We were due to have an updated slide in 2019, but that was delayed. And then clearly we went into the pandemic, so that's been delayed as well. But if we look at 2018, we found that almost 7,000 people ended their life through suicide. And men under 50, it was one of the biggest killers. And also young people aged 16 to 24. And sadly, 3 out of 4 suicides were by men. And we think there's a number of reasons behind that, but we think that predominantly men are still reluctant to talk about their feelings and their emotions, no matter how many campaigns that have been out there about men speaking out about this. And I think also some of the methodologies for suicide that men use. And I think the other sad statistic is the lower your socioeconomic group, the more likely you are to be touched by suicide. So clearly one of the Samaritans' visions is that we want fewer people to die by suicide. And we're doing that in a number of ways. I mean, one is our core function of being Samaritans by taking calls, by answering emails, but also, like this evening's webinar, we feel there's a function and a need to outreach into our communities to tell people about the Samaritans and what we do, but also to tell people about some of the tools and techniques that we use as Samaritans, in that they can adopt those and use those if they're speaking to people in distress in their communities. So I'm going to put up a list of behavior or signs that you will recognize if somebody is struggling. And I think it's obvious that anyone that was displaying some of those behaviors or signs, it would be clear to most people that they weren't doing very well with regards to their emotional health. But I think it's important as well, the people that are quite silent, the people that put on the brave face. But I think if you know somebody fairly well, there's those subtle changes that you might pick up on. So it's not perhaps as obvious as some of those behaviors, but they're very subtle, and it might sort of prompt you just to ask, are you okay? Sean, I'm going to hand over to you now on how to open up a conversation.
Thank you. Many of us avoid asking other people how they are for fear of a response, or because we don't think it's our business, or you might be worried about saying the wrong thing and making it worse. The truth is, if we have taken the time to approach someone who seems to be struggling, shown we care about them and that we're interested in what's going on for them, we can't really get it wrong. At least we've let them know we are there for them. Remember, listening can help someone work through what's on their mind. When people listen to, it can save a life. Are you okay? Ask twice. Are you okay? Are you really okay? I don't know if any of you saw that Roman Kent documentary that was on recently when a friend of his took his life. That's one of the things that Roman was saying was, are you okay? Are you really okay? As most people, when you say, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. End of conversation. So his friend took his life. Asking people will say, okay, thanks, ask another time. So a few thoughts about helping someone open up when they seem to be struggling. How to open up a conversation. Choose a good time and somewhere without distractions. Use open questions that need more than a yes or no answer. Are you okay? Ask twice. Are you okay? Are you really okay? How are things? I've noticed you don't seem quite yourself. Listen well. How's that making you feel? Avoid giving your view of what's wrong or what they should do. How many friends of yours have said, well, if I was you, I would do this, I would do that? That's not listening. That's giving your point of view to somebody.
Thanks, Sean. So now I'm going to take you through the difference between passive and active listening. And as Samaritans, we've been trained to look at active listening. So really, passive listening, I think, is what we do all the time. If you're walking down the pavement and there's traffic going past, you're barely aware that there's traffic going past, but you can hear it in the background. If you're sitting perhaps in the garden, reading a book or looking at your phone, you may be able to hear bird sounds and bird songs in the background. But it's just there. It's only when you stop and listen to a particular bird song, then you go from passive to active listening. And it's the same with the Samaritans. We recognize that active listening is a learned skill. It's something that we have to practice, but putting in the effort certainly brings the benefits when we're listening to our callers. We use a lot of techniques within the Samaritans to help us focus on the callers and to make sure that we, like I said, use different techniques to make the call active listening. So, for example, we use something called the listening wheel. We use silence quite a lot with Samaritans. We use short words of encouragement, such as go on, yes, mm-hmm. That's enough sometimes to encourage somebody to carry on speaking. We clarify just to make sure that we understand, and we'll go through each one of these points later on with a shush technique. So with the shush technique, as I said, it is a mnemonic, so it's 5 letters, and again, it helps us understand how we need to sort of actively listen when we're talking to somebody, when we're taking a call, and we'll go through each one of those letters now. Sean?
To show you care, focus on the other person, make eye contact, and put your phone away. To really listen to somebody, you need to give them your full attention. Maintain eye contact and be engaged. Get into the habit takes practice, so don't be too hard on yourself and keep using these handy tips. When starting a conversation, resolve not to talk about yourself at all. For your own practice, keep a listening diary just for a week. Record how many times you listened really well, note what challenges and distracts you, and what things went well. Aim to learn at least one new thing about the person who is talking to you.
Thanks, Sean. So the H is have patience. And this is really about putting yourself in the other person's shoes. If they are going through, fairly significant emotional turmoil, it might take them a while to want to speak to anyone about it. So really give them that opportunity. And if you ask somebody, would you like to tell me about how you're feeling? If they say, no, I'm not ready, or I don't want to speak to you at this point, don't be put off by that. So have patience. Say to them, I am here for you. So when you're ready to start speaking, come and speak to me. But maybe we'll try a little bit later, maybe have a conversation a little bit later, or we'll try tomorrow, and really sort of encourage that person that you are there for them. And importantly, have patience as well. So if they do start talking to you about what's worrying them, but they stop and they're silent, again, avoid the temptation to jump in and sort of fill that silence with some of your thoughts, really. That silence might be useful to allow them to think about what they've said to you, and also use that silence yourself to reflect on what they've said and really perhaps how the conversation is going to develop from there. Sean?
So you use open questions that need more than a yes or no answer and follow up, e.g. tell me more. So an open-ended question means not jumping in with your own ideas about how the other person may be feeling. These questions don't impose a viewpoint and require a person to pause, think and reflect, and then hopefully expand. Avoid asking questions or saying something that closes the conversation down. Open-ended questions encourage them to talk. The conversation is a safe place that you are holding for them. Nothing they say is right or wrong. Try asking. Some examples of open questions. How are you feeling today? How are things going? Not, all good for you? How has your day been? Not, have you had a good day? So have you been feeling very stressed by this piece of work? How long have you felt like this? Not, have you felt like this for long? That sounds really difficult for you. Would you like to tell me a little bit more about how that makes you feel?
Thanks, Sean. And then say it back. So really that has a number of purposes, but one, it's your opportunity to check that what you've been told is accurate, that there's been no misunderstanding. So for example, if somebody says to you, my marriage has been very difficult over the last couple of years, you can say that back. So you say your marriage has been very difficult. That must be very hard for you. Are you able to tell me a little bit more about that? It also gives a sense of empathy as well. So it shows that person that you're actively listening. So you're taking on board everything that they are saying to you. And as I said, you're saying it back to them, really. Sean?
H, have courage. Don't be put off by a negative response. And most importantly, and again, don't feel you have to feel the silence, like Paul mentioned earlier. Sometimes it can feel intrusive and counterintuitive to ask someone how they feel. You'll soon be able to tell if someone is uncomfortable and doesn't want to engage with you at that level. You'll be surprised at how willing people are to listen and how sometimes it's exactly what someone needs to be able to share what is going on in their mind. When Chad started in the church, he was a counsellor himself, but he had people that came to see him, and while they were waiting, there was people they were having a cup of tea and they're talking to. And that's how Chad realised that by the time they'd spoke to the ladies and gentlemen that they're having tea with, they didn't want to see him because they had opened up and told them everything before they actually met him.
Thanks, Sean. So that's our Shush technique. It's very simple. It's surprising how 5 letters can be so powerful in having a structured conversation with somebody that shows that you're actively listening to what their concerns are. So we're at the point now of just summarizing perhaps what we've talked about so far. So clearly it's important to focus on that individual. So to make good eye contact, put away any distractions as well. If it's a work situation and you're working 9 till 5, perhaps don't have that conversation at 5 minutes to 5 when you'll be both trying to leave to go home at that point in time. So make it a little bit planned, really, as to when you're going to have that conversation. As I said, focus completely on the other person and use the shush technique to help you remember how to do that. As we said, don't be afraid of silences. I know normally when we're speaking with family, friends, colleagues, the conversation is usually free flow and it's back and forth. I think we're not used to having somebody talk and then pause for a bit. And I think, the natural instinct is to feel uncomfortable and fill that space. But as I said earlier, try and use that silence as a positive thing. Use it as a technique to allow the speaker to reflect on what they've told you, and also for yourself, use it to understand, comprehend, and reflect on what they've told you as well. As we say, use the say it back part as well to show that you've understood fully, but also that you've got empathy with what somebody is telling you. Resist putting your interpretation on it. That's, again, a very human thing to do. If somebody is in quite a lot of distress, sometimes the way to try and help rescue them is to try and give your experiences. So, for example, the example I gave where somebody says, I've been having trouble with my marriage. It's very tempting to say, if you've had that experience, oh yeah, I had that a couple of years ago and we went to marriage guidance and we're fine now. Remember, this is about this person's experience. You may have had similar experiences, but you wouldn't have exactly the same experience because obvious reasons, because everyone is different. And importantly, don't give up. As I said, if you try, have that courage that we talked about. If you ask somebody whether they'd like to talk about how they feel and they say to you, I'm not ready, or I don't want to talk about it, then say, well, I understand that, but I'm here for you and maybe we can try a little bit later. But if you do start to have a good conversation, or even if somebody says, I'm not ready to talk, then really make a commitment to set a future date. So say, we had a really good talk today. Thank you for telling me that. Shall we try again and speak on Friday at about 3 o'clock? How does that suit you? Okay, so a little bit about perhaps how you can use the Samaritans if you're worried about somebody and you think that perhaps they would benefit from speaking to a trained Samaritan. There's a number of ways you or they could do that. They can call us, or you can call us on 111, 116 123. That's a free phone number as well, and it's available, as I said at the start, 24/7, 365 days a year. You can email it. Some people may not feel ready to talk, but they could put their feelings down in writing. So again, there's an email address there. But remember, that might take a little bit longer to get a response from an email. And some people may want to write everything that they're concerned about in a letter and send that off to the Samaritans. And again, that'll take a little bit longer to have a response. Before the pandemic, we would also invite people in to have a face-to-face meeting with a Samaritan. Some people prefer that. They feel it's more personal than using any of the other sort of media. Closed down because of the pandemic, but we hope as the pandemic and the lockdown and the restrictions start to lift, we can start opening our doors as well to face-to-face sessions with people. If you want to make a referral on somebody's behalf, we call it a third-party referral, you can certainly do that. So you can do it either by telephone or by email. Most people, as a third-party referral, would choose one or the other there because I think they're looking for a slightly quicker response. If you do that, we'd ask you to supply some information. Firstly, that we have your name and your contact details. We have the name and the contact details about the person that you're concerned about and a little bit about why you are concerned. But most importantly, that you've had that person's consent, that you can refer them on to the Samaritans. I think there's nothing worse than if you are struggling emotionally and you're not ready to talk fully to anyone, is if you get a call out of the blue, and most of our calls, if not all of our calls, are withheld from our switchboard. So you get a withheld call and you answer it, and it's a Samaritan asking you whether you'd like to talk to them, really. So bear that in mind as well. You can also direct people to our internet site. There's a lot of useful tools on that that can help people who are perhaps struggling with their mental health, One particular is the self-help app. So it's their self-help.samaritans.org. And on that site, there's a number of tools that people can use. So, for example, if somebody's particularly anxious, there's some tools there about how to manage their anxiety. And there's also some discussion points there as well that people find interesting to perhaps recognize they're not alone with that particular condition. So again, use that. Okay, guys, I think we've come to the end of our webinar. As Jane said at the start, it was a very brief introduction to Learn to Listen. Jane, I know you've been sort of fielding any questions in the background. Were there any questions that you feel that you could share with everyone or share with Sean and myself? Or again, for any of the people participating with us this evening, if there's any last minute questions you want to ask, now is your opportunity.
So thank you both, Paul and Sean, for doing that presentation. Thank you very much. We do have a question already, and we have a question from Angela, and that was when you were talking through the Shush techniques, and she asked, what if someone asks, what would you do? So how would you answer somebody saying, well, what would you do?
Do you want to answer, Sean, or shall I answer? I mean, or both of us can answer if you like.
Yeah. The call is about the person, not about you. So you talk to them, and as you're talking to them, you say, the call's about you. It's not about myself. And try to get them to open up and ask a couple more questions.
And I agree exactly with Sean. As I said in one of the earlier slides, I think that's how we're trained, is through active listening and through our sort of techniques that we use, is to get that individual to try and come to their own decisions about how they can move forward, really. So yes, we would explore, perhaps, if they said, well, what would you do in this situation? We'd say, like Sean said, let's talk about you. What do you think your options could be? And see if we could get people to sort of think and talk around their own individual options.
And when you're talking to them, you might find that there's something they've said earlier in the conversation. You might say, you remember earlier when you told me about X? Would you like to tell me more about that? And try to explore a bit more with them. And show that you're actually listening, that there's a question they've said earlier or something they've mentioned earlier that you've caught on to and you've actually brought it back into the conversation.
Thank you both. There was a follow-up question or two around the same issue, really. So Josie's saying, with friends, sometimes I find it helps them to open up and feel less alone if I share my own experience. If it's a friend, is that okay? Oh.
I think so. I think, you know, it's slightly different with a friend, isn't it? Because you know them well, you've got that emotional engagement with them, and you know, you would probably understand that by sharing some of your own experiences might help them, really. I don't know, Sean, what you think.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. It's a different situation when you're there. You know that person a bit more. The person on the call is anonymous to us, so we don't know all the background, so you take it on face value what they're telling you.
Jane, what do you think?
I think I would add that in a normal conversation as a pair of pals, no problem. But if you do have the sense that your friend is troubled by something and is in some form of distress, then that's when stepping back with your own experience and opening up your thoughts and your mind to what they're saying, that's when that would be important. So trying to use the techniques that we were describing, if you felt that a friend was troubled and wanting to talk about something seriously, then it's actually quite a hard thing to do when we're used to a particular format of conversations, and it just takes a bit of practice. Bite your tongue and don't talk about yourself, and actually you'd be surprised by how much it enables other people to put their thoughts forward. Thank you for that question, Josie. There is another question as well. Rebecca asks, do you have any tips for support? Do you have any tips to support colleagues in the workplace, in particular, where individuals might be more reserved with opening up? So, any tips for supporting colleagues in the workplace?
I think it's using some of the techniques we talked about, really, because I recognise that in a workplace the dynamic is slightly different. Dynamic is slightly different with friends. As Sean said, it's slightly different when we're Samaritans, we're taking calls, really. But I think for work colleagues, they may be desperately hoping that somebody will recognise that they're not feeling well, and they're hoping that somebody will ask the question. So I think just using some of those techniques we talked about, just saying, I've noticed you're not yourself. Is there anything you'd like to talk to me about, really? And I think, it's that kind of, don't give up sort of thing. If they say, no, I'm fine, nothing's wrong, saying to them, well, I'm here if you do want to talk, then maybe, perhaps I can check how you're feeling tomorrow and just do something like that.
Yeah, in the workplace, in the workplace, if there's an opportunity to maybe say, oh, do you want to come for a cup of tea, and just quietly go somewhere where you can talk without a group of people that maybe your colleagues all meet together at lunchtime. It's saying, oh, do you want to have a coffee somewhere a bit quieter, or a place that's convenient for that, to just have a chat and gradually talk to them and see if they start to open up with you.
Yeah, thank you both for that. There's a different question from Lynn. She says, as Samaritans, do your family and friends know that you volunteer with them? I'm going to start with an answer first and see whether you disagree with me. So, historically, Samaritans used to work locally. So the branch in Gloucester would cover Gloucestershire, in which case it was important that people didn't share the fact that they were Samaritans very broadly, in case one of their friends needed to call Samaritans and were anxious that they might be finding themselves talking to a friend. It was more personal, and so Samaritans tended to keep quiet about that. But these days, the calls go to any one of the 201 branches around the UK, so you can get an answer from somebody in any part of the country, and we take calls from all over the UK and Ireland. So it's less likely that you're going to come across somebody that you know, and therefore it's less important in that sense that we keep that role that we play to ourselves. I think some of the longer term Samaritans still hold on to that belief that it's better just to not be talking about it. For myself, I tell people, my friends know. Obviously, it's really important that you don't talk with anybody about the calls that you've had. So that's an absolute. You don't talk about anybody that you've spoken with, to your husband, to your kids or whoever. But they all know. And I think my husband was a bit worried if I was coming back at 2:30 in the morning and he didn't know where I'd been. How about you guys? Do you tell people?
I'm quite a new Samaritan, and friends and family and a couple of people that I volunteer with in other organisations are aware that I'm a Samaritan. And it's not a problem, but like Jane rightfully says, as soon as you walk out of the building, the conversations and the calls stay in that building. Nothing is discussed outside of that building.
I agree, and yes, family, friends and work colleagues know that I'm a Samaritan. And I think there's something in that. If you look at all of us Samaritans that are working in the branch, we've all got different backgrounds, different experiences. And I think, particularly talking to colleagues in work that, you are a Samaritan, that sometimes encourages people to ask those questions about, what you do as a Samaritan. Maybe I'd like to become a Samaritan as well. So I think sometimes you get that engagement about people showing interest about, as I said, joining the Samaritans as well.
There's a slightly additional dimension for the three of us and for those of us who are doing the presentations this week, because we're all part of our branch's outreach team. So we are the volunteers who go out to events, to schools, to colleges, to give talks, to have a presence, so that we raise awareness of what Samaritans do out in the community, and where there's a community maybe in particular need of support. For example, if there's been a suicide in a public place or a suicide in the community, it could have a real knock-on ripple effect throughout the community. So we would aim to have a presence there so that people know we're there to talk if they need it. So, for example, you may be aware of that tragic stabbing of a young lad in the Cam Dursley area the other week. 17-year-old boy was fatally stabbed. So I organised for our Samaritans van to go down there maybe half a dozen times. So we've got all our contact details on the side of the van. We didn't need to actually talk to people. We're just saying, we're here. This is our number if you need to talk to us. So as outreach volunteers, our faces are known. So we have to be comfortable with that. Yeah. So another question from Anna, who says, would you like to talk about children contacting Samaritans? Okay, thank you, Anna. So I'll start. Maybe you guys would mop up what I miss out. So we were asked a similar question yesterday, and the first response was to say that we do take calls, and particularly emails, from all ages. So we are able to respond to children and young people. We are particularly careful with how we handle young people's calls in terms of safeguarding. And we maybe, if it were to be appropriate, we might signpost them to Childline, which is particularly set up for children and young people. That's not always welcomed and it's not always appropriate. So we are happy to maintain an email conversation or to have a call with a young person in the same way that we would be with adults and people of all ages, even into their 80s and 90s sometimes. Anything else that you guys would want to add to that?
Just to support that, Jane, particularly around the safeguarding and, being very aware of that, really. But I think, we recognise that younger people use messaging quite a lot, as, whether it's the social media messaging. So we've started, as I said, we're a national organisation, so it's slowly been launched through different branches, and that's instant messaging as well. And we recognise that younger people and children will probably be engaged in that because it feels very similar to what they do with their friends and that sort of thing. So we recognise that that'll be another opportunity for children and young people to start speaking to us as well. But with all the sort of caveats that Jane said about being careful and signposting and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with both Jane and Paul. It's and we all go through a safeguarding policy within Samaritans. So we, like we say, we signpost people when required.
Yeah, that's right. So it's 8:15 now. We haven't got any other questions coming through. So I wonder whether we might say that that's it for tonight then. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Sean. Thank you all for attending. And if you would like to have a recording of this, then thank you for a great. Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you for a great session. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you all. Bye bye.